to talk reasonably about immigration. That act changed my friend's life. I only learned about it years later. Growing up in Texas means growing up in the tensions of who controls the border, who has the right to be here, and who does not. Those frictions are one of the few constants in the history of this state. I grew up thinking those conversations about the border were issues to be learned about from school and books, and that they had nothing to do with me. When I was 9, we left San Antonio for my dad's job, and I spent a miserable school year in Tennessee. On the first day at my new school, my classmates cornered me, asking where my boots were. I didn't have any. Where I left my horse. I'd ridden twice in my life, both times in a circle at the rodeo. And if I knew any Texas Rangers. It turns out I did. We didn't stay gone long. Less than a year later, we were back in West Texas with twisted mesquites and tumbleweed instead of the live oaks and wildflowers I missed so fiercely. An awkward, bookish kid in a town where it seemed like every other girl was a basketball player or cheerleader. I had a hard time fitting in for years. That's probably why it took me some time. But eventually, I fell in love with that part of Texas too. I stayed here for college. In my literature classes, I learned more about the state and my place in it than I had ever known. A handful of lines I read in Borderlands La Frontera by Gloria Anzaldúa burst open a truth about Texas I'd been stumbling towards but hadn't yet been able to put into words. Her memoir sections were about growing up in South Texas, not far from my mom's hometown of Pleasanton. The first time I read Anzaldúa, I wanted to position myself as I always had in books, alongside the plucky young protagonist, as an underdog setting out against the odds. Anzaldúa, through her writing, firmly and clearly picked me up and placed me on the other side of the line. We, the gringo, were locked into the fiction of white superiority. Perhaps embarrassingly, that book was the first time I read a history of Texas that did not center people who looked like me. In the 1800s, Anzaldúa wrote, Anglos migrated illegally into Texas, which was then part of Mexico, in greater and greater numbers, and gradually drove the Tejanos, native Texans of Mexican descent, from their lands, committing all manner of atrocities against them. Reading those lines made me uncomfortable. It made me want to put the book down, to justify myself, to explain that I wasn't like those Anglos. But I kept reading. By the end of the book, I felt a new understanding opening up in my mind. For the first time, I heard voices from the same land in Texas I had always loved, but who had very different experiences from my own. It was only a start, the smallest of steps. But when I moved away from Texas as a young adult, I was beginning to view the layered stories of my home in a new way. Leaving gave me valuable clarity. At the time, I thought, like so many of my family members before me, that I was never coming back to Texas. I taught English in Southeast Asia and South America, learning to sleep in rickety hostel beds and gaining a forever craving for spicy street food. I married a man who also loves to travel. Jonathan and I spent most of our 20s adventuring. We fished for piranhas in the Brazilian Pantanal, while jabiru storks flapped giant wings over the water. We bunked on overnight Soviet-era trains from Slovenia into Italy to avoid paying for hotel rooms. We woke to the lazy roar of lions at the zoo next door in Guadalajara, Mexico. We felt the thrum of the discotheques beneath us through the floor of our cheap apartment in Santiago, Chile. In those years, I consciously dropped my Texas accent, tried to stop saying y'all, and got by with faltering but improving Portuguese and Spanish. I had almost convinced myself by my late 20s that I had no desire to move back to Texas, which is why I was unprepared for the surge of pure longing I felt when I walked on the campus at the University of Texas, where I was interviewing for the English graduate program while visiting our families for the holidays. A future unfurled before me in an instant. Me on the